The air was thick with tension. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, the estate lay still, almost unnaturally so. The vast, sprawling grounds of the Lord's residence, with their manicured lawns and towering hedges, gave no hint of the chaos that was about to unfold. The creatures, captive and wild, were preparing to be released into the very heart of this empire of control, but not just to roam free. Today, they would be part of something darker, something far more sinister. The Lord's test, the cruel experiment he had set in motion, was about to begin. And little did he know, the very beasts he sought to control would soon render his dominance over nature irrelevant. Lord Ferdinand Blackwood, a man of vast wealth and even greater ambition, had long been fascinated by power, not just over men, but over nature itself. To him, beasts, creatures of the wild, were merely instruments to be bent to his will, loyal servants to his every command. He viewed them not as living, breathing beings, but as tools, as symbols of his might. For years, he had amassed a collection of savage, dangerous creatures from all corners of the world: lion, tiger, bear, and wolf. His estate had become a twisted kingdom where man and beast were meant to coexist under his absolute rule. Rumors about Lord Blackwood's peculiar ways had begun to spread long before the incident. His obsession with control over the natural world was well known, and many whispered that his cruelty towards the creatures was unparalleled. They spoke of how the Lord would pit animals against each other in brutal spectacles, watching with delight as they fought for their survival. Those who dared to question his methods were met with cold silence or hushed responses. The Lord was not just a man, he was an enigma, a man who had elevated cruelty to an art form. But the Lord had grown restless, discontented with merely watching the creatures fight for his amusement. He wanted something more. He sought to test them in a way that would prove his absolute mastery over them, a challenge of his own design. The plan was set in motion one fateful evening. A grand, open-air arena was constructed in the heart of his estate, surrounded by towering stone walls, with a central platform where the Lord could stand and survey the chaos below. The beasts, having been conditioned to respond to his every command, were to be released into this arena, where they would be forced to choose a side. They would either fight for the Lord's honor or stand against him in a battle that would test their loyalty and ferocity. It was a game to him, a cruel test of power and control. The Lord believed that by manipulating the instincts of these creatures, he could demonstrate once and for all that no force of nature, no matter how savage, could stand against him. What the Lord failed to realize was that nature was not something to be conquered. It was a force that could not be bent or manipulated without consequences. But for Lord Blackwood, that lesson would come too late. As the day of the test approached, whispers began to spread through the halls of the estate. Servants who had long been subject to the Lord's whims began to feel a growing sense of dread. They spoke in hushed tones, fearing that something was wrong, that the Lord's plan was doomed to fail. Yet, none dared speak openly of their fears. They had learned long ago that in the presence of Lord Blackwood, to question was to risk everything. The day of the experiment arrived, and the estate was filled with a palpable sense of anticipation. Guests, invited to witness the spectacle, arrived early, eager to see the Lord's mastery over his beasts. Some believed the event would be a grand display of control, a testament to Lord Blackwood's unchallenged authority. Others, more perceptive, could sense the danger lurking beneath the surface. Yet none could have predicted the horrors that were about to unfold. The arena was set, the creatures caged and ready. One by one, they were released into the open space, their eyes wild with a mixture of confusion and aggression. There were lions, their golden manes rippling in the wind, tigers, their sleek bodies coiled like springs, ready to pounce, wolves, their jaws snapping in hunger and rage. The Lord stood at the edge of the arena, his eyes gleaming with anticipation, his hand raised to signal the beginning of the test. At first, the beasts appeared to follow the Lord's command, circling the arena in a carefully orchestrated display of obedience. But then something changed. The first to break ranks was a massive bear, its heavy paws thudding against the ground as it charged toward the Lord. The crowd gasped, unsure if this was part of the plan. But as the bear neared the Lord, it abruptly stopped, its eyes narrowing, its body tense with aggression. It turned away from him, its massive form retreating into the shadows. Then it was the wolf's turn. It, too, hesitated before making a sudden, unexpected move. It howled, a bone-chilling sound that reverberated through the arena, before darting away from the Lord's side and joining the other beasts in a defiant cluster. The tigers followed suit, their movements graceful yet filled with a newfound sense of independence. The Lord stood motionless, his eyes wide with disbelief. His mind raced, scrambling for an explanation. This was impossible. These creatures had been bred to obey him, to follow his every command. And yet, here they were, rejecting him, defying him at every turn. Panic began to set in as the Lord realized that he had lost control. His carefully constructed world, where he ruled over the beasts with an iron fist, was crumbling before his eyes. As the creatures circled, their behavior growing more erratic, it became clear that something far beyond mere disobedience was at play. There was a darkness in their eyes, a deep, primal fear, or perhaps something more sinister. The Lord's experiment had backfired, and now, he was the one who was at the mercy of the very creatures he had sought to dominate. The atmosphere in the arena became suffocating, as the Lord's mind spiraled into a state of disbelief and desperation. He shouted at the beasts, ordering them to stop, to return to their place. But his commands fell on deaf ears. The creatures no longer viewed him as their master. They were no longer his obedient servants, but wild, untamable forces of nature. And with that realization came the terrifying truth: the Lord had underestimated them, and now he would pay the price. The scene that unfolded next was nothing short of chaos. The beasts, once confined by the Lord's will, now ran free, their primal instincts taking over. They no longer feared the man who had imprisoned them, and their fury was unleashed in full force. The Lord, caught off guard and surrounded by the very creatures he had hoped to control, was helpless. His arrogance, his cruelty, had led him to this moment of destruction. The sound of roaring beasts filled the air, a cacophony of fury and fear. The Lord's cries were drowned out by the sounds of growling and howling as the creatures tore through the arena. The guests, who had once eagerly awaited the spectacle, now screamed in terror, running for their lives as the savage animals surged forward, their eyes wild and untamed. The Lord's cruel experiment had shattered his illusion of control, and in its place stood only chaos and terror. The beasts, for reasons unknown, seemed to target the Lord specifically. One by one, they closed in on him, circling like predators ready to strike. The once proud Lord, who had reveled in his dominion over nature, now found himself a mere mortal in the face of nature's wrath. The test he had devised to prove his superiority had instead proven the depth of his hubris and the uncontrollable power of the wild. In the end, the Lord was overwhelmed. The last sound he heard was the roar of a lion, its claws tearing through the air as it lunged toward him. And then, all was silent. The creatures, once again, were still. The arena, now a scene of unimaginable carnage, stood as a testament to the Lord's folly, a cruel reminder that no man, no matter how powerful, could ever truly master the forces of nature. As the sun set on that fateful day, the Lord's experiment had come to a brutal and tragic end. The estate, once a symbol of his might, now stood as a monument to his arrogance and his downfall. The beasts had chosen their side, and it was not with him. The question remained, why? What had happened to the creatures? And what had driven them to reject their master in such a violent, defiant way? The answers, like the Lord's legacy, would be lost to time. The estate, sprawling across hundreds of acres, stood as a towering monument to Lord Blackwood's wealth, power, and obsession. The mansion at its center, a Gothic structure of imposing stone and iron, cast a long shadow over the surrounding land. It was a place where opulence and darkness intertwined, a domain that seemed to breathe with the weight of its lord's ambition. From the manicured gardens to the dense forests that bordered the estate, everything was carefully curated to reflect Lord Blackwood's iron will. But beneath its grandeur, the estate held secrets, secrets that only a select few were privy to, and fewer still dared to speak of. The land had been in the Blackwood family for generations, passed down through the centuries, each new lord inheriting not only the wealth and title but the burden of maintaining its dark legacy. Lord Blackwood, a man of calculating intelligence and cold ruthlessness, had grown up within these walls. From a young age, he had been immersed in the family's obsession with nature, science, and control. The estate was not just a home, it was a laboratory, a place where experiments were conducted, and dark ideas were nurtured. Lord Blackwood had always been fascinated by animals. As a child, he spent countless hours studying the creatures that roamed the estate's grounds, observing them from afar, as if trying to unlock the secrets of their behavior. But as he grew older, his fascination turned into something far more sinister. He began to collect exotic animals from all over the world, some of the most dangerous and rare creatures known to man. Tigers, lions, wolves, even a pair of bears, all confined to cages or large enclosures within the estate. The Lord viewed these creatures not as wild animals but as trophies of his conquest over nature. He believed that by breeding and training them, he could demonstrate his mastery over the natural world. The estate's grounds, once home to carefully manicured gardens and ornate fountains, were gradually transformed into a labyrinth of cages, pens, and observation towers. These beasts, living in cramped conditions, were often subjected to cruel training methods designed to break their wills and make them obedient to their master's commands. Lord Blackwood would often spend hours alone in the observation towers, watching his beasts through thick glass windows, contemplating their behavior as though they were pieces on a chessboard, to be manipulated and controlled at will. But the Lord's obsession went beyond mere control. He was driven by an insatiable desire to prove his supremacy, to show the world that he was not just a ruler of men but a ruler of nature itself. He began to conduct his own experiments, pushing the boundaries of what was considered ethical in the scientific community. It was whispered in the surrounding towns that he had hired unqualified scientists and naturalists to assist in his projects, men and women desperate enough for money to ignore the moral implications of the Lord's demands. Rumors circulated about strange procedures, unnatural breeding techniques, and bizarre experiments that took place within the darkened halls of the estate. But no one dared question the Lord's authority, for his wealth and influence reached far beyond the borders of his land. As time passed, the estate became an even more unsettling place. Guests were rarely invited, for Lord Blackwood had no need for the company of others. Instead, he preferred the company of his beasts, those wild creatures who had become his sole obsession. His interactions with them were cold and calculated, as though he were a general directing his soldiers rather than a man engaging with living creatures. Some say that, as the years wore on, the Lord began to change. His once sharp features grew gaunt, his eyes hollow with the constant pursuit of domination. He no longer slept, spending entire days in the observation towers, watching his beasts, plotting his next move. The townspeople, once in awe of the grandeur of the estate, had begun to speak of Lord Blackwood in hushed tones, referring to him as a madman, a cruel tyrant who cared more for his creatures than for the people who lived under his rule. The estate, which had once been a symbol of wealth and power, had become something far darker. It had transformed into a prison, not just for the animals, but for Lord Blackwood himself. He was trapped within the walls of his own obsession, unable to escape the suffocating need to prove that he could control the uncontrollable. The locals would often exchange stories of the Lord's eccentricities, tales that ranged from strange occurrences within the estate to whispers about the Lord's growing disconnect from reality. Some claimed they had seen him wandering the woods at night, speaking to the trees as if they could respond. Others spoke of sightings of him standing on the balcony of his mansion, staring out over the land for hours, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if waiting for something, or someone, to come to him. It was said that his thoughts had become increasingly erratic, that his mind was consumed by the idea of proving himself, not just to the world, but to nature itself. But it wasn't just the Lord who had changed. The animals, too, had begun to behave differently. At first, the creatures appeared to be docile, obeying the Lord's commands with remarkable precision. They were bred and trained to be loyal, to respond to his every order. But slowly, over time, their behavior began to shift. They seemed to grow more restless, more unpredictable. Their eyes, once filled with the dull acceptance of captivity, began to gleam with a strange intelligence. The tigers, once the epitome of grace and obedience, now paced their enclosures endlessly, their jaws snapping at the air. The lions, once content to lounge in the sun, now watched the Lord with an intensity that unsettled even him. The wolves, whose loyalty had been the Lord's greatest pride, began to growl and snarl at him from across the fence, their once submissive nature now replaced by an underlying aggression. The servants, who had long been at the mercy of the Lord's whims, began to notice the change in the atmosphere of the estate. They spoke of an overwhelming sense of unease that hung in the air, as though the estate itself was alive with a dark energy. Even the horses, which had always been calm and gentle, seemed to sense something amiss, their movements jittery and unpredictable. It was as if the very land around the estate was beginning to rebel, responding to the Lord's cruelty with an undeniable force. Despite the growing unrest, Lord Blackwood remained blind to the warning signs. He was fixated on his experiments, convinced that the only way to prove his superiority was to push his beasts even further. And so, he continued to subject them to harsher conditions, more intense training, and crueler tests of loyalty. He believed that if he could force them to obey him completely, it would be the ultimate demonstration of his control. But in his arrogance, he failed to see the consequences of his actions. It was during this time that Lord Blackwood decided to carry out the most ambitious experiment of all, a test that would involve not just one or two creatures, but all of them. He envisioned an arena, a grand spectacle where his beasts would be set loose to do his bidding. It was to be the culmination of his work, the moment when he would prove, once and for all, that he could master the forces of nature. The decision to move forward with the test came without warning. Lord Blackwood had become obsessed with the idea, unable to think of anything else. He issued the orders to have the arena built, using the finest craftsmen to construct a vast, circular structure within the heart of his estate. It would be the perfect setting for his final test. The creatures would be released, one by one, and forced to choose their loyalty, either to him or against him. What the Lord failed to understand was that his creatures, though captive, were still wild at their core. They were not his to command. They were not tools to be used in his twisted game. They were living, breathing beings, driven by instincts that no amount of training could suppress. And the Lord's actions, in his desperate pursuit of dominance, would awaken something within them that he could never control. The creatures were not merely animals, they were symbols of the untamable, the primal force that would soon rise up against him. As the final preparations were made for the test, the atmosphere around the estate grew heavier. There was an undercurrent of tension that seemed to pulse through the air, a sense of inevitability that something terrible was about to happen. The servants, the few who dared to stay on the estate, felt it most of all. They could sense the storm brewing, though they didn't know exactly what form it would take. But they knew one thing: Lord Blackwood had gone too far. And they feared that the consequences of his actions would be far worse than anyone could imagine. The day of the experiment arrived under a sky that seemed darker than it should have been. There was a heavy air about the estate, an oppressive silence that hung over everything, as though the land itself knew something terrible was about to unfold. The usual sounds of birdsong and rustling leaves were absent, replaced by a subtle, unnerving stillness. Even the wind, once a familiar presence on the vast grounds, seemed to hold its breath. Lord Blackwood, undeterred by the strange atmosphere, paced around the arena, his mind consumed with the anticipation of what was to come. To him, this test was everything, a final proof of his genius, his supremacy over the natural world. Yet, beneath the surface of his arrogance, there was a flicker of doubt. It was faint, but it lingered in the back of his mind, a whisper that perhaps he had pushed too far. The arena had been designed for one purpose: to trap the beasts and test their loyalty. A circular space, surrounded by high stone walls, was the setting for the cruel spectacle. The Lord's staff had worked tirelessly to prepare it, ensuring that every detail was perfect. The air within the arena had a charged quality, like a trap waiting to spring. Lord Blackwood had spared no expense. The finest craftsmen had built it, creating an environment where he could control the chaos, or so he thought. The floor was made of compacted dirt, with large wooden posts placed at intervals for the animals to be tethered to, should they need to be restrained. High above, in the observation tower, the Lord would have the perfect vantage point to witness the beasts' reactions as they were released one by one. But as the first beast was led into the arena, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The creature, a massive, snarling lion, was brought forward with a leash held tight by a trembling handler. Its golden mane rippled in the wind, its eyes glowing with a predatory gleam. The Lord's eyes lit up at the sight. This was the moment he had been waiting for. His voice rang out, authoritative and cold, as he gave the order to release the creature. The lion, however, did not obey. It stood there for a moment, its head held high, before it snarled and lunged at the handler, forcing him to retreat in fear. The Lord's smile faltered. The creature had never acted this way before. It was supposed to be under control, trained to follow his every command. With a snap of his fingers, the lion was released fully into the arena. The Lord's heart raced as he watched the animal pace back and forth, its eyes scanning the surroundings with increasing agitation. The once confident Lord found himself uneasy, as if the lion was silently judging him. The air grew thick with tension. The lion's steps grew more erratic, as if it could sense something beyond the Lord's command, something deeper in the fabric of the estate itself. The beast moved to the far side of the arena, its massive form circling the walls as it emitted a low, menacing growl. The Lord's voice, commanding and sure, cut through the silence, instructing the animal to come to him, to obey. Yet the lion ignored him entirely, its attention fixed elsewhere, its posture more defensive than submissive. It was as if the beast were rejecting him, challenging his authority. The Lord's command faltered in his throat. He had not anticipated this. He had trained these animals, broken their wills until they were loyal to him, or so he thought. The lion's behavior was an aberration. It was a defiance he had never encountered before. He barked out another command, his voice sharp with frustration, but the lion did not move. Instead, it turned its back on him, ignoring his presence entirely. The crowd of onlookers, most of whom had come with great expectations, shifted uncomfortably, murmuring among themselves. Some were beginning to question the Lord's ability to control the creatures he had once claimed mastery over. It was then that the Lord's anger began to show. His hand clenched into a fist, his jaw set in determination. He had built his life on the belief that he was untouchable, that his mastery over the beasts was absolute. And yet here he stood, staring at the back of a lion that had defied him in the most humiliating way. His arrogance flared up again, forcing him to ignore the creeping sense of doubt. He issued another command, more forceful this time, and the lion turned to face him. The beast's golden eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, the Lord saw something there, something cold, something that sent a shiver down his spine. The lion was no longer simply an animal. It had become something else, something that transcended the boundaries of obedience and control. The Lord's heart skipped a beat as the lion slowly began to walk toward him, its movements deliberate, calculated. The beast's steps were slow, measured, as if it was savoring the moment, savoring the power it had over its captor. But just as the lion drew closer, something unexpected happened. It stopped dead in its tracks, turned, and with a flick of its tail, walked away from him. The Lord's eyes widened in disbelief as the lion approached the edge of the arena, where it stopped, its back turned to him. The Lord stood frozen for a moment, as the realization began to sink in. The animal wasn't obeying him, it was choosing. It had decided to ignore him completely. The Lord's command was not the only voice in the arena that day. A second creature, a massive tiger, was led out into the space. The tiger, unlike the lion, did not hesitate. It moved swiftly and purposefully, its sleek body gliding across the dirt. The Lord's gaze sharpened, his hope rising. Perhaps this beast would be more compliant. But again, his expectations were shattered. The tiger, after a brief inspection of the arena, turned to face him. Its eyes narrowed, and it bared its teeth in a threatening display. For a brief moment, the Lord thought the tiger might charge at him, but instead, it, too, turned away. It began to pace around the perimeter of the arena, ignoring him entirely, as if he were nothing more than a passing nuisance. The crowd was silent now, the tension in the air palpable. The Lord stood at the center, surrounded by the creatures he had spent years training, each one now defying him, rejecting his control. His mind raced, scrambling for an explanation. He called out to the tiger, to the lion, demanding that they return to their place, to obey. But neither responded. Instead, the beasts circled the arena, their movements growing more erratic and unpredictable. It was as though a switch had been flipped within them. The Lord's calm demeanor began to crack, his grip on the situation slipping. His voice grew more urgent as he repeated his commands, but the beasts only seemed to grow bolder in their defiance. They no longer looked at him as their master, but as an intruder. The animals had turned the tables. They were not in cages anymore. They were free to act on their instincts, and their instincts were clear: they rejected him. The Lord's chest tightened as panic set in. This was not how it was supposed to go. His grand experiment, his moment of triumph, had already begun to unravel. Each passing moment felt like a crushing defeat, as his carefully constructed world of control shattered before him. The crowd, too, began to feel the tension rise. Some of the guests began to back away from the arena, unsure of what they were witnessing. The spectacle had turned into something dark and dangerous, something they had not expected. Whispers filled the air, their voices a mix of disbelief and fear. The Lord, however, remained steadfast in his determination. He could not allow himself to appear weak, not in front of those who had come to witness his greatness. But as the beasts continued to defy him, a sense of dread began to settle in the pit of his stomach. He had spent so long controlling them, bending them to his will, that he had never considered that they might one day break free from his grip. And then, something far worse happened. The wolf, once the most loyal of all his creatures, stepped forward from the shadows. It had been watching the chaos unfold, its eyes gleaming with something that was neither fear nor submission. It looked at the Lord, and for a long moment, they locked eyes. The Lord's heart skipped a beat as he realized that the wolf, too, was no longer the creature he had tamed. It, too, had chosen to defy him. It stepped into the arena, joining the other beasts, and for the first time, the Lord understood the truth: this was no longer a test of obedience. It was a rebellion. A revolt. And he was helpless in the face of it. As the silence of the arena stretched on, broken only by the low growls and restless pacing of the beasts, the sense of dread in the air became nearly unbearable. Lord Blackwood stood frozen, his mind swirling with disbelief, anger, and a sinking sense of panic. His once unshakable confidence, the very foundation of his character, was now shattered. The beasts, his creations, his carefully cultivated companions, had turned against him in a way he could neither comprehend nor control. The lion, the tiger, and the wolf, the very creatures he had spent years training and shaping, had rejected him with an ease that felt almost deliberate. The crowd that had gathered to witness the spectacle, their faces full of eager expectation only moments earlier, now stood in stunned silence. Some had begun to back away, their eyes wide with unease, but most of them remained rooted in place, unable to tear their gaze away from the unfolding nightmare. They had come to see the great Lord prove his power over nature, to witness the culmination of his cruel experiment. Instead, they were watching his empire crumble before their eyes. The tension in the air seemed to thicken with every passing second. Lord Blackwood's mind raced as he struggled to make sense of what was happening. The animals were not attacking him, not yet, at least, but they had refused to obey him, and that was perhaps worse than any violence. They were not just disobeying, they were choosing to ignore him completely, as though they no longer recognized him as their master. It was as if the foundation of his control had been ripped away, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. And in his heart, a cold, gnawing fear began to take root. He turned to face his closest advisors, standing at the edge of the arena, hoping for some reassurance, some explanation. But their faces mirrored his own confusion and fear. They, too, had expected the beasts to respond to his commands, to prove their loyalty in the way they had always done. But now, it was as though the creatures had become something else entirely, wild, unpredictable, and untamable. The Lord's voice faltered as he called out once more, his commands becoming more frantic, more desperate. But still, the beasts did not respond. The lion continued to pace back and forth, its massive form cutting through the dirt, its eyes glinting with defiance. The tiger, too, moved with purpose, its sleek body moving like liquid shadow, its gaze fixed on the Lord with an intensity that was almost unnerving. And the wolf, the creature once regarded as the Lord's most loyal, now stood at the far side of the arena, its posture tense and alert, its eyes filled with a knowing hostility. Lord Blackwood's hand trembled slightly as he raised it again, a final attempt to regain control, to show his power. His voice, once commanding and resolute, now carried a note of uncertainty as he shouted at them, his words sharp and cutting. But instead of obeying, the beasts only seemed to grow bolder in their defiance. The lion stopped its pacing and turned to face the Lord, its eyes narrowing, its teeth bared in a silent challenge. The tiger, still circling the perimeter of the arena, paused and locked eyes with him, its body coiling in preparation for something, though what, the Lord could not tell. And the wolf, ever watchful, began to move closer to the others, its form sleek and graceful, as though it were becoming part of something larger, something beyond the Lord's control. As the minutes passed, the Lord's frustration grew. He could feel his heart racing, his breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. He had never imagined a situation like this. He had believed that, no matter how wild the creatures he controlled might seem, they were ultimately his to command. He had always been able to bend them to his will, whether through cruelty or careful training, but now, it felt as though the very animals he had sought to dominate had found a way to defy him, to reject him utterly. He could sense their growing resistance, not just in their actions, but in the way they regarded him, no longer as a master, but as an intruder in their world. A deep unease settled in his chest, and for the first time, Lord Blackwood began to question whether he had gone too far. Had he, in his arrogance, overestimated his ability to control them? Had he underestimated their instincts, their capacity for rebellion? As the moments stretched on, his mind began to race, searching for some explanation, some reason for the creature's behavior. But there was nothing, no logical answer, no scientific theory to explain what was happening. All he could feel was the weight of his own failure pressing down on him. The crowd, too, was beginning to sense the shift in the air. What had started as a grand spectacle was quickly turning into something dark and unsettling. The guests, initially eager to witness the Lord's triumph, were now whispering among themselves, their voices filled with uncertainty. Some had begun to back away, eyes flicking nervously to the beasts, unsure of what they were seeing. Others stood frozen, unable to look away from the terrifying spectacle unfolding before them. The Lord's reputation, once so formidable, now seemed fragile in the face of the very creatures he had sought to control. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, the first act of defiance occurred. The lion, having grown increasingly agitated, turned abruptly and lunged at one of the handlers who had been standing near the edge of the arena. The handler, caught off guard, screamed in panic and stumbled backward, falling to the ground. The lion's massive paws raked across the dirt as it moved toward him, but the handler scrambled away in time, managing to escape to the safety of the outer gates. For a moment, the lion stood still, its eyes focused on the retreating figure, its breathing heavy and labored. But then, without warning, it turned back toward the Lord, and for a brief, fleeting moment, their eyes locked. The beast's gaze was filled with something that could not be mistaken, contempt. It was as though the lion was aware of its own power, of its own choice to reject its former master. The tiger, too, had begun to display signs of aggression. It stopped its pacing and fixed its gaze on the Lord, its muscles tense, coiled like a spring ready to snap. The crowd gasped, some stepping back in fear, as the tiger let out a low, rumbling growl. Its eyes glinted with malice, and for the first time, Lord Blackwood realized the true depth of his error. The tiger was not merely an animal to be tamed, it was a force in its own right, a creature of nature that could not be bent to his will. And now, it seemed to understand that it no longer had to obey. The wolf, ever the silent observer, had moved into the center of the arena, its body sleek and fluid. It stood between the lion and the tiger, its eyes glinting with a dangerous intelligence. The creatures, once isolated in their cages, were now forming a kind of unity, a pack, bound not by the Lord's control, but by something deeper, something primal. The Lord's breath caught in his throat as he realized that the beasts were no longer simply animals, they were something else entirely. They had become symbols of his failure, his hubris, and they were now united against him. The Lord's voice trembled as he called out again, but this time, his words were empty, hollow. The power he had once commanded over these creatures had evaporated, leaving only a fragile shell of what had been. The beasts ignored him, their eyes filled with disdain, their movements fluid and deliberate. They had made their choice, and Lord Blackwood's fate, once so certain, now hung in the balance. The terror that had slowly begun to creep into his mind now took root in his chest, spreading like wildfire. The fear was palpable, heavy in the air, as though the entire arena had become a trap, and he was the prey. The animals were no longer his to control. They were free, wild once more, and their freedom was his undoing. What had started as an experiment, a display of dominance, had transformed into something far darker, a reckoning. The crowd, sensing the shift, began to murmur again, but their voices were no longer filled with awe. They were filled with fear. Fear for the Lord, fear for themselves, and fear of the unknown power that now radiated from the beasts. And as the seconds stretched into eternity, Lord Blackwood realized that he had lost. He had played a dangerous game, and now, the consequences were unfolding before him, as inevitable and unstoppable as the creatures he had sought to control. The atmosphere around the arena had become suffocating, each passing moment more tense and fraught with the sense of impending catastrophe. The wild creatures, once obedient and confined to their cages, had transformed into something unrecognizable. Their eyes, once dull and submissive, now burned with a ferocity that sent a shiver down the spine of every onlooker. The Lord, standing alone at the center of the arena, had become a mere figure in a landscape he no longer understood. His mind raced in desperation, but nothing he had learned, nothing he had carefully orchestrated over the years, seemed to matter now. The beasts, his creations, his instruments of power, had turned against him. Lord Blackwood's grip on reality was beginning to slip. The once mighty Lord, the man who had sought to bend nature to his will, now found himself utterly at the mercy of the very forces he had sought to dominate. He watched as the lion, the tiger, and the wolf circled the arena, moving with a predatory grace, their eyes fixed on him. They were no longer the creatures he had spent years training, they were wild, untamed, and far beyond his reach. The Lord's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of his failure pressing heavily on his chest, suffocating him with every breath. The crowd, once full of eager anticipation, had fallen into a state of stunned silence. The Lord's reputation, built on years of calculated control and cruelty, now hung by the thinnest of threads. The whispers had started, soft at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Some feared for the Lord's safety, others feared for their own. The beasts had already made their decision, and that decision was clear, they had rejected their master. The consequences of this rejection were still unfolding, but the air around the arena buzzed with a palpable sense of dread. The once grand estate, the symbol of Lord Blackwood's power, now felt like a tomb. The first movement came from the wolf. It was subtle at first, a shift in posture, an almost imperceptible change in the animal's stance, but it was enough to make the Lord's blood run cold. The wolf, once the most loyal of his beasts, began to move towards the others, its sleek body moving with fluidity and purpose. It did not look at him. It did not acknowledge him. It simply moved, joining the others in their slow, deliberate circling of the arena. The wolf had not only abandoned its position as his most obedient creature, it had joined the rebellion. And that was the final blow to the Lord's confidence. His mind raced with confusion and disbelief. Why were they doing this? Had the years of training, the countless hours of conditioning, been for nothing? He had studied their instincts, their behavior, and yet here they were, turning on him as though they had never known him at all. He had thought he could master them. He had thought that, with enough control, enough manipulation, he could bend even the wildest of creatures to his will. But now, standing in the middle of the arena, he realized that he had miscalculated. He had overestimated his own power and underestimated the primal forces that had once belonged to these creatures. The lion let out a deep, guttural growl, the sound reverberating through the stone walls of the arena. It was not a sound of submission. It was a sound of defiance, a warning. The Lord's eyes widened as the lion's massive form moved toward him, its golden mane rippling in the wind, its muscles coiled in anticipation. But even as the creature neared, it did not charge. It did not attack. It simply walked with deliberate slowness, its gaze never leaving the Lord. The air seemed to crackle with tension, and for a brief moment, Lord Blackwood felt as though the entire arena was holding its breath. The lion's eyes locked with his, and in that instant, he understood. The beast was not acting out of instinct. It was not simply hungry or angry. It was making a choice. A conscious decision to reject him. The tiger, too, had stopped its pacing and now stood still, its body poised in a defensive posture. Its gaze, intense and unblinking, was fixed squarely on Lord Blackwood. The Lord's heart hammered in his chest as he realized that this was no longer just an act of disobedience. The animals were not merely failing to follow his commands, they were actively rejecting him, rejecting the very idea of his dominance. They had become something more than the creatures he had controlled. They had become symbols of nature itself, untamable and free, and he, the Lord who had believed himself to be above such forces, was powerless to stop them. The realization hit Lord Blackwood like a physical blow, stunning him into momentary paralysis. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stood in the center of the arena, surrounded by beasts who once answered only to him. The idea that he could lose control of them, that they could choose to turn against him, was more than his mind could process. He had spent years shaping their behavior, bending them to his will, and now he stood alone, a failure in his own domain. The crowd's whispers grew louder, a mix of fear and disbelief in their voices. No one had expected this turn of events. Some of the guests, sensing the growing danger, began to edge away from the arena. Others stood frozen, unable to tear their eyes away from the spectacle. It was clear that the Lord's control over the beasts was unraveling, and with it, the illusion of his power. His reputation, once built on cruelty and domination, was now being ripped apart in front of their very eyes. The wolf, now standing with the other creatures, turned its head slightly toward the Lord. Its eyes, cold and unfeeling, locked onto his with an almost knowing intensity. The wolf's body was low to the ground, its muscles tense, as if it were preparing for something. But what, exactly? The Lord's pulse quickened, the panic beginning to set in as he realized that he no longer had any understanding of the situation. The creatures were no longer bound by his will. They were free. And then, as though on cue, the lion, the tiger, and the wolf began to move in unison, circling the arena with fluid, deliberate movements. The Lord's mind scrambled for an explanation, but none came. His commands, once so effective, now sounded hollow and meaningless in the face of this rebellion. The beasts moved in perfect harmony, as though they were connected by some invisible thread that transcended his control. The once loyal creatures had become a pack, a force united not by his will, but by something far more primal. Lord Blackwood's breath hitched as he realized that the arena, once a symbol of his power, had become his prison. He had built it to control the creatures, to assert his dominance over nature, but now it felt like a cage he had willingly entered, and one he could not escape. The ground beneath him, the stone walls surrounding him, seemed to close in, and for the first time, Lord Blackwood felt a deep, visceral fear. The creatures were not just rejecting him, they were mocking him. His carefully constructed world of control had crumbled, leaving only chaos and defiance in its wake. The beasts were no longer mere animals. They had become something else entirely, symbols of the untamed, of the forces that cannot be controlled, no matter how much power one possesses. They had transcended their roles as instruments of his control. They had become agents of their own fate. And Lord Blackwood, once so certain of his superiority, now found himself helpless in the face of that force. The crowd, too, had begun to understand what was happening. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence, as if everyone present was holding their breath. The Lord, once seen as a figure of immense power, now appeared small and insignificant in the face of the creature's defiance. His empire, built on domination and cruelty, was falling apart before them all. The moment of triumph he had so eagerly anticipated had turned into a nightmare, and no one, not even the Lord himself, knew how it would end. As the beasts continued to move, their synchronized movements like a dance of rebellion, Lord Blackwood felt the full weight of his arrogance crashing down on him. He had sought to control them, to make them his servants, but in doing so, he had failed to see the one truth he could not control, the untamable nature of the creatures themselves. And now, as the arena filled with their powerful presence, the Lord understood that he was no longer their master, he was their prey. As the beasts moved in unison, their slow, deliberate circling of the arena was a haunting display of power and control. The lion, the tiger, and the wolf, each of them had once been symbols of Lord Blackwood's dominance, his triumph over nature. Now, they had become his undoing. His stomach churned as he watched them, each step they took against the dirt reverberating in his chest like a drumbeat signaling the end of an era. The Lord had no words left. His mind raced, but the thoughts were jumbled and incoherent, as if his brain was desperately trying to process the reality unfolding before him. Every fiber of his being told him to act, to do something, anything, to regain control. But as the beasts continued their movement, fluid and methodical, a chilling realization settled deep in his bones: he no longer held the reins. There was nothing left for him to command. The animals had rejected him in the most humiliating way possible. They had shown him that no amount of cruelty, no twisted science, and no years of manipulation could tame them. They were free, not just physically, but in a way the Lord could never have imagined. He could feel their eyes on him, all three of them, a cold, unblinking gaze that pierced through the air with an almost unnatural focus. The lion's eyes were filled with contempt, the tiger's gaze, once so full of obedience, was now filled with hostility, and the wolf's eyes glinted with something far darker: knowledge, awareness, and perhaps even judgment. It was as if they had transcended their animal forms and were now fully aware of the Lord's deepest fears. They were not just creatures anymore, they were a reflection of his own hubris, his belief that he could control the uncontrollable. They were his creation, and yet they had risen above him, leaving him in the dust of his own making. A sinking feeling overtook him, a crushing weight of realization that his control, which had once seemed absolute, was now nothing more than a shattered illusion. The years of training, the cruel experiments, the manipulation, all of it had led to this moment. He had thought himself a master of nature, but in truth, he had only been its puppet. The animals, the creatures he had forced into submission, had finally broken free, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. And now, they had become something far more dangerous than he could ever have prepared for. They had become unpredictable. Lord Blackwood's breath came in shallow, rapid bursts, his chest tight with panic. He could hear the rustling of the crowd behind him, their whispers rising in volume. Some had already begun to retreat, their eyes wide with fear as they watched the unfolding scene. He could sense the shift in the energy around him. what had begun as awe and reverence for the great Lord's power was now giving way to disbelief and terror. Even the servants, who had been conditioned to serve without question, were no longer certain. The once dominant figure of Lord Blackwood was now a broken man, standing in the middle of an arena that he had built to demonstrate his superiority, but which had now become the very place of his undoing. In the midst of this chaos, the lion took another slow step forward. It was subtle at first, a minor shift in its posture, but the Lord's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the movement for what it was. The beast was no longer simply circling. It was preparing for something. The Lord's instincts, honed by years of observing and controlling these creatures, screamed at him to move, to do something, but he was frozen in place. His mind was clouded, unable to formulate any plan or action. The truth was inescapable, he was out of his depth. As the lion drew closer, the tension in the air became almost unbearable. The beast's eyes never left his, the predator and the prey locked in a silent battle of wills. Lord Blackwood could hear the pounding of his own heart, each beat louder than the last. He had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed. The lion was no longer the submissive creature it had been, responding to his commands. It was a force of nature, and it was moving closer, with every step drawing it nearer to the Lord's position. For the first time in years, Lord Blackwood felt something he had long ago abandoned, fear. The tiger, too, had stopped pacing and was now fixed on him with an intensity that made the Lord's blood run cold. Its body was taut, muscles coiled, ready to spring at any moment. The Lord could see the power in its sleek form, the speed in its movement. It was as if the tiger was waiting for some signal, some indication from the Lord, but nothing came. The beast knew, just as the lion knew, that it no longer needed the Lord's commands. It was free, and in that freedom, it was dangerous, more dangerous than it had ever been within the confines of its cage. The wolf, meanwhile, had moved into the center of the arena, standing between the lion and the tiger, its body poised like a sentry guarding a precious treasure. Its eyes never left the Lord, and though it did not move, its presence seemed to amplify the growing sense of dread. The wolf was the most intelligent of the creatures, and its behavior was different now, more calculated, more aware of its surroundings. It had not only rejected the Lord's control, it had become a symbol of the pack, a unified force of nature that was no longer bound by the Lord's whims. The Lord's thoughts were spiraling, each one more frantic than the last. His mind sought desperately for any way to regain control, any tactic, any action he could take to restore the order he had once imposed. But the truth was undeniable, the beasts had already made their decision. They were not going to obey him. They were not going to be manipulated, controlled, or subdued. They had broken free of the chains that had once held them, and in doing so, they had proven to him that no matter how much he tried to bend nature to his will, it would always find a way to break free. In his desperation, Lord Blackwood turned to his advisors, who had been standing by, watching the events unfold in stunned silence. But even as he looked to them, he knew it was too late. They, too, were powerless in the face of the rebellion that was unfolding before them. The Lord's control, once so absolute, had crumbled, and now the very beasts he had trusted to demonstrate his mastery over nature were turning against him. The crowd had fallen completely silent, their eyes fixed on the scene in front of them. Some of the guests were too afraid to move, while others had begun to flee, their retreating footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. No one knew what would happen next, but the tension in the air suggested that whatever came next would be catastrophic. For the first time in his life, Lord Blackwood felt truly helpless. The animals, those creatures he had spent so many years trying to dominate, had turned the tables on him. They were no longer the objects of his control. They were the masters now, and he was their prey. The realization stung like a sharp blade, cutting through his pride, his arrogance, and his sense of superiority. In that moment, as he stood surrounded by the creatures he had tried to subjugate, the truth became clear: Lord Blackwood had underestimated the very forces he thought he could tame. He had believed that with enough control, enough cruelty, he could bend nature to his will. But nature, it seemed, had its own plans, plans that could not be manipulated, no matter how powerful or intelligent a man might be. And as the lion took another step forward, its massive form looming closer, Lord Blackwood realized that the moment of reckoning had arrived. The beasts had already chosen. They had already rejected him. And now, he was left to face the consequences of his arrogance. The arena, once a symbol of his power, had become the place of his undoing, and there was no escape. As the moments dragged on, Lord Blackwood's grip on reality seemed to slip further away. The beasts, his greatest creations, the very creatures he had trained to obey him without question, had now become the harbingers of his downfall. The lion, the tiger, and the wolf circled him with increasing confidence, their movements synchronized, their eyes locked onto him with a terrifying intensity. The Lord's mind raced, but no solutions presented themselves. He had thought that he was the master of the situation, that no force of nature could defeat him, that his will was stronger than anything he could face. Now, that same force of nature, in the form of the very animals he had manipulated, was proving just how fragile his belief had been. The lion's growl echoed through the arena, deep and guttural, resonating within the stone walls. It was not a sound of mere aggression, it was a declaration of power, a reminder that this creature, once subjugated by the Lord's whims, was now untouchable. Its eyes never wavered from Lord Blackwood's figure, and as it circled him, its muscles rippling under its golden fur, the Lord felt his chest tighten with fear. His breathing became shallow, each inhale a struggle, as though the very air around him had become thick and suffocating. The lion had become a symbol of everything he had failed to control, a living testament to the consequences of his arrogance. The tiger, meanwhile, had stopped pacing and now stood in a quiet, watchful stance. Its body was low to the ground, every muscle coiled in perfect readiness, as if it were prepared to pounce at any moment. The tiger's gaze remained locked on the Lord, its eyes glowing with a malevolent intelligence that had never been there before. The Lord could almost feel its thoughts, a deep understanding of the situation, of the rebellion unfolding before him. The tiger was no longer just an animal under his control. It was a force of nature, as wild and untamable as the winds themselves. And then, there was the wolf. It had taken its place between the lion and the tiger, its sleek body positioned as though it were the mastermind of the group. The wolf was the most intelligent of the creatures, and it seemed to understand the implications of this moment more fully than the others. Its piercing gaze never left Lord Blackwood, its eyes sharp with a kind of knowing that made the Lord's skin crawl. The wolf had always been his most loyal companion, the one animal he could always rely on. But now, it was a part of the rebellion, a symbol of the very forces he had tried to subdue, now united against him. The weight of the situation bore down on Lord Blackwood, pressing the air out of his lungs. His thoughts were a blur, a chaotic mess of strategies and commands, but none of them would work. The animals were no longer responding to him. They were not reacting to his voice or his threats. They were beyond his reach, beyond his control. They had chosen, and in doing so, had made it clear that no amount of cruelty or manipulation could ever bind them to his will. They were free now, free in a way the Lord had never truly understood. And in their freedom, they were terrifying. The Lord's gaze flickered to the crowd, but their faces were now a blur of fear and disbelief. Some had already begun to flee, their hasty footsteps fading into the distance, while others stood rooted to the spot, their eyes wide with terror. They had come expecting to witness the Lord's triumph over nature, to see his dominance asserted once more. But what they were witnessing now was something far more horrifying, the collapse of that very dominance, the destruction of an empire built on cruelty and control. The Lord had once been a figure of awe and admiration, a man who had bent the wild to his will. Now, he was the one standing helpless in the center of the arena, surrounded by the creatures he had failed to master. His throat tightened as he realized the full extent of his failure. The beasts had never been his to control, not in the way he had believed. He had spent years thinking he could tame the wild, bend nature to his will, and impose his dominance over the creatures of the earth. But now, as he stood at the mercy of those very beasts, it was clear to him that he had never understood the forces he was playing with. He had believed that cruelty and dominance could create obedience. But obedience was a fragile thing, and without it, the creatures he had once commanded had become wild once more. It was not their fault. It was his. He had miscalculated, and now, he was paying the price. The lion took another slow step forward, its body moving like liquid gold, its eyes never leaving the Lord. The tiger followed suit, its body tense with anticipation, its sharp gaze fixed on its prey. And the wolf, ever the observer, remained in the center, its eyes darting between the other two, a silent orchestrator of the rebellion. The Lord could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the rhythm of it matching the slow, deliberate steps of the beasts as they closed in on him. His mind screamed at him to do something, anything, but his body refused to respond. He could feel the weight of his failure in his limbs, a crushing weight that kept him rooted in place. The world around him had become a blur of movement and sound, the growls of the lion and the tiger filling the air, the thundering of his own heartbeat drowning out all else. And then, in a moment of clarity, it hit him, he was no longer the Lord. He was no longer the master. He was the prey. The beasts had taken the power from him, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. They had torn down the walls he had spent so long building around himself, and in doing so, they had exposed the truth he had long avoided: he was no different from them. He was no different from any of the animals he had sought to control. He, too, was a creature of nature, subject to its whims, its rules, its unforgiving forces. And just as he had tried to subdue the creatures before him, so too had nature found a way to subdue him. The lion's growl broke the silence, a sound of finality, of dominance. It was a sound that reverberated through Lord Blackwood's very soul. The beast was not just warning him, it was declaring its victory. It had reclaimed its place in the world, as had the tiger, and the wolf. Together, they were a force that no man, no matter how powerful, could hope to control. And the Lord, once so sure of his superiority, was now left to face the consequences of his arrogance. The crowd, who had once watched in awe, were now watching with a mixture of fear and fascination. Some of them were still rooted to the spot, unable to look away, while others had begun to flee, their panic spreading like wildfire. The Lord's reputation, once so formidable, was now nothing more than a distant memory. He had once been a man of power, a man who could bend nature to his will. Now, he was just another figure in a world that had long since stopped answering to him. The Lord's eyes darted from one beast to the next, but there was no escape. He had no control over them, no power to stop them. The weight of his failure, the crushing realization of his impotence, was too much to bear. He had believed that cruelty could create power. He had believed that by breaking the beasts, he could own them. But in doing so, he had underestimated the very thing that had once made them his subjects: their wildness, their instinct, their freedom. And now, in the arena where he had once been a king, he was nothing more than prey. The beasts were circling closer now, their movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. The Lord stood frozen in place, unable to move, unable to speak. The sound of his own heartbeat thundered in his ears, drowning out all other noise. The world around him seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer, the silence more oppressive. The animals, once his tools, had become his undoing. And as they closed in on him, the realization hit him with the force of a physical blow: he was not their master. He never had been. And now, there would be no escape from the reckoning he had so carefully avoided for so long. The arena was no longer just a place, it had become a manifestation of Lord Blackwood's shattered reality. Every breath he took felt like a struggle as the beasts closed in, their bodies moving with a rhythmic, predatory grace that made his stomach churn. The lion, the tiger, and the wolf, each one a symbol of his twisted pursuit of power, had surrounded him, and their eyes locked onto his with a chilling certainty. They no longer saw him as the master, he was now nothing more than a figure to be ignored, an obstacle to their freedom. The Lord's mind raced in desperate circles, trying to find some way out of the situation. He had been the one in control for so long, manipulating and dominating these creatures, molding them into instruments of his will. But now, standing amidst the very beasts he had sought to bend to his control, he realized how fragile his power had always been. The deep growls of the lion and the low, throaty rumble of the tiger echoed in his ears, each sound a reminder that they had broken free from the cage he had built for them. The wolf's quiet, knowing gaze was the final nail in his coffin. There was no escape. As his heart thundered in his chest, the Lord's mind drifted back to the earlier moments of this spectacle. He had been so confident, so sure that this final display of dominance would cement his place in history as the master of all creatures. The crowd had watched, eager for his victory, the triumph of science and cruelty over nature's raw power. But now, as he stood frozen in the center of the arena, that same crowd was no longer in awe of him. They were terrified, their eyes wide with fear as they watched the animals circle with deliberate, unnerving movements. Some of them had already fled, their frantic footsteps fading into the distance, but the rest remained, their faces pale with a mixture of horror and disbelief. The Lord had never imagined it would come to this. He had always believed that he was above the wild, that he could outsmart nature, overpower it with his intellect and resources. But as the beasts continued their slow, inexorable approach, it became clear to him that they were not merely animals anymore. They were something more. They were forces of nature, primal and untamable, and he was nothing more than a man caught in their wake. His eyes flickered to the lion again, its massive body moving with the fluidity of a predator, its gaze still locked on him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. He had raised this beast, trained it to respond to his every command, but now, the lion was a mere shadow of what it had been. It had become something far greater, something that no longer needed him. The Lord's hands trembled at his sides as he tried to summon the words, the authority that had once commanded this creature's obedience. But there was nothing. No words came. No commands were obeyed. The lion's growl deepened, the sound reverberating through the stone walls of the arena, and Lord Blackwood knew with sickening certainty that he was utterly powerless. The tiger, too, had moved closer, its sleek body flowing with a predator's grace, its eyes gleaming with malevolent intelligence. It circled him with calculated precision, each movement deliberate, as if savoring the moment. The Lord's breath caught in his throat as the tiger stopped just a few feet away from him, its gaze never leaving his. The creature was a reflection of the Lord's own hubris, a creature that had once been subjugated, but now had risen above him. The tiger had found its strength, its purpose, and in doing so, had left Lord Blackwood behind. But it was the wolf that brought the most chilling realization. The wolf, the animal he had considered his most loyal, stood at the center of the arena now, its eyes glinting with an eerie knowledge. Unlike the lion and the tiger, it did not make any aggressive movements, but its presence was more unnerving than either of the others. It was as if the wolf, in its quiet intelligence, understood the weight of the moment more than the Lord himself. It was the wolf that had orchestrated this rebellion, the one that had brought the others together, and now it stood there, its eyes locked with the Lord's, as if judging him. Every muscle in the Lord's body screamed for him to do something, to move, to speak, to act, but he was frozen in place, trapped by the realization that there was no longer any way to assert control. The arena, which had once been his domain, had become a prison. The very creatures he had sought to dominate were now free, their movements a silent declaration that no force, no matter how powerful, could ever truly control them. The Lord had been a fool to believe that cruelty could create power. He had misjudged them all, and now, they were showing him the true meaning of power, something raw, untamed, and impossible to bend to his will. The minutes stretched on like hours, and with every passing moment, the Lord's sense of helplessness deepened. The beasts continued to circle, their eyes never leaving him, their growls becoming more frequent, their tension palpable. The silence in the arena was broken only by the rhythmic sound of their movements and the Lord's own labored breathing. It was as though time had come to a standstill, each second hanging heavy with the weight of impending doom. The crowd, once full of anticipation, had now become a collection of fearful witnesses, unable to tear their eyes away from the unfolding nightmare. Their whispers, soft at first, had grown louder, and the air around them seemed to crackle with anxiety. The Lord, once their revered figure of strength and control, was now a mere figure in the center of the arena, his power slipping away with every moment. His eyes searched desperately for something, anything, to regain the upper hand, but the truth was inescapable. There was no way out. He had underestimated the very forces he thought he could control, and now, he was paying the price. The lion growled again, a deep, rumbling sound that echoed through the arena, and the Lord flinched involuntarily. The sound reverberated in his chest like a warning, and for the first time in his life, he felt small, insignificant, powerless.